Welcome and thank you for joining our session today. We are excited to have you here for our Pathlock Innovation Series. This is our next session, and the title of today's session is Establishing a Multi-Tiered Security Strategy for SAP S/4HANA and Beyond. I'm going to put a link into the chat. It's pathlock.com/innovation-series. And at that link, you can go ahead and see all of the sessions that will be happening today, tomorrow, and Thursday. If there are any other sessions that you're interested in, we encourage you to register for those sessions, and we hope to see you there. I also have a few housekeeping items to go over. If you have any audio issues during this webinar, click on Preferences and then Audio. From there, you can check to see if you're using the appropriate audio device. You can also click on the play sound to check if you can hear the sound coming through your speakers. There will be a Q&A session following this presentation, so please type any questions into the question box that you'll see on your control panel for our speakers to answer at the end of the event. To prevent background noise, everyone is on mute. And with that, I'll turn the time over to our speakers to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Stephanie. I really appreciate the introduction. I appreciate everybody being here. My name is Steve Dubrovac, and I am going to be presenting with two of Pathlock's finest engineers, Jonathan Strauss, who joins Pathlock through a recent acquisition that focused on SAST and the securing of the SAP platform. He's been in the security space since 2015, and so has a lot of experience. And Aditya Goka, who's a solution engineer and has been doing security and architecting SAP security for a couple of decades now. So we've got a pretty august group of folks to help walk through how do you go about securing the entire SAP stack. What do we mean when we say 3 tiers of control? Here's a short overview of the agenda today. And just before we get into it, I know that a lot of you on this call are very busy folks. SAP has that, that's part of the nature of SAP, is that there's always things to do. So I know that it is, it's a sacrifice for some of you to be here, and I think we've got a lot of content that will make that a very positive thing for those who have joined. The 3 tiers of control will cover what that means in terms of the SAP architecture, and then we'll show a demonstration of how you can exploit the SAP landscape if you don't have that first tier properly secured. We'll talk about a second tier around user governance, a third tier around transactions and data control, and then we'll show another demonstration of how to improve control over data and the transactions that affect data in your SAP landscape. And then we'll close. This will roughly be about 45 minutes of presentation, followed by questions from you. So as we go along, please feel free to either ask questions in the chat or to be prepared for a Q&A session at the end. So what do we mean when we say securing your SAP landscape? You know, there's a lot of challenges that happen with SAP. 2 out of 3 SAP environments are breached from the outside. It's interesting that almost a third of data breaches are due to missing application patches. There's a significant amount of cost whenever your SAP system goes down, and sometimes downtime is actually a function of patching and proper configuration of your SAP landscape. Ultimately, there's reputation damage, a 7.3% average stock decrease. You know, there was also an interesting study done by McKinsey some time ago that showed a 14 to 17% equity premium that's available to those companies who have strong security over their IT infrastructure. And so there's some positive sides as well as you show a strong control over your SAP landscape. When we talk about controlling all of these threats, if you will, a good model to follow is a 3-tier model. A 3-tier model starts with securing the platform itself, ensuring that each instance across your SAP landscape is properly patched and secured and then remains secure. The second tier of application control is with regard to users, looking at how do you orchestrate access governance in order to maximize productivity and minimize risk, so that those people who are trying to use your SAP capabilities can do so when it's appropriate and are blocked from using it when it would be inappropriate. And then at the top layer, the third tier, is looking at data and transactions. That means that the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data is maintained efficiently, and that any transactions that may impact that data inappropriately are flagged or blocked. And so for the rest of this presentation, we'll start talking about these 3 tiers of control in terms of the platform, user governance or access governance, and then the data transaction layer. When it comes to looking at the foundation of SAP, securing the actual platform itself, it's pretty shocking if you look at the timeline since 2012, for just the last decade, what has begun to happen across the world when it comes to attacks against your SAP environment. And all of these attacks are happening in a context where there's a 90% probability that the platform has not been configured properly. You know, the first public exploit in 2012 has eventually led to, if you look at 2021, a record number of patches being released on SAP's patch day back in September. 99 SAP applications affected by Log4j vulnerability, and even the government getting involved in and creating binding directives for how to properly secure your SAP environment. I have a bit of a humorous way of talking about what's happening when it comes to the SAP landscape and patches. Everyone who runs SAP is very familiar with Patch Tuesday. Each month, SAP brings together the patches that are necessary for various instances that are being run around the planet. But what some people don't realize is that on Patch Tuesday, there's a kind of a lot of bad agents who are looking at that information as well. And so what I call Widespread Wednesday is that now the world of bad actors is now alerted to potential weaknesses in the SAP landscape, and that allows them to begin to build their, you could say, their backlog of tools and capabilities that they are going to develop in order to exploit those vulnerabilities in those environments that have not been patched in a timely manner. And then after Widespread Wednesday comes Toolkit Thursday, where all of those bad actors now begin to build toolkits to automate the exploitation of those weaknesses that were identified based on the announcements made on Patch Tuesday. And then after Toolkit Thursday comes Freak Out Friday, where all of those environments that have not been patched, now obviously it's not this quick, it's not Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, but I just use it as a way of kind of thinking about how once Patch Tuesday happens, there becomes an obligation on everyone who is running SAP to go through and quickly patch their environments, because there are a lot of people, even nation states, a lot of bad actors who are going about using the information that was provided on Patch Tuesday to then begin to build toolkits to exploit those who have not properly patched their landscape. When we look at this first tier, we ask three basic questions. Is the platform itself secure? Are customizations of that platform, is the code that is customizing that platform secure? And then, is the platform under attack? Those are the three primary questions for this first tier. And it's challenging. 57%, for example, in a recent survey showed that they're unable to quickly identify the vulnerabilities at the application level. So 57% cannot answer that question very well. And then in terms of, is the code or the customizations of their landscape, is that secure? And again, almost 80% have talked through how they don't actually build security features into their apps. And from an SAP conversation, this is really around are the transports that are changing the configuration, that are changing the code deployments in the SAP landscape, are those transports making changes that can be exploited in the SAP landscape, or are those transports improving the security and hardening the SAP landscape? And lastly, 63% are unable to tell whether or not they're under attack. And there's a variety of reasons for this. One of the more prevalent reasons isn't just due to continuous monitoring or the visibility by the different security operations center tools, but it's because within SAP, the patterns of attack are very nuanced, and the time across which those patterns are manifest can be quite long. The average hacker can look at an exploit that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 days in terms of how long they're willing to do one step at a time so that the pattern doesn't manifest itself in a single day or a single week or even a single month or quarter. And so how do you look across time to identify those particular patterns of it that show that the system is under attack is a real challenge. From a Pathlock perspective, how do we look at covering that first tier? We look at, first of all, assessing the ERP landscape, the RFCs that might be encroached or might be used by hackers to get into that landscape, and the broader ecosystem upon which the SAP platform is running. We have over 4,000 checks to make to identify where there may be unacceptable vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities that could be patched. And then those checks are constantly being updated, and that continuous scanning is tied into a proper oversight program that includes ticket management. And then there are dedicated scientists that are constantly honing their SAP specific knowledge. On the security testing side, it's not just looking at, is the code written well? Of course, that's important, looking at coding patterns, but it's also understanding transports that's moving that code or other configuration settings, and ensuring that that those are being properly scanned. It's also worth noting that best practices around code changes over time. So to properly secure that first tier, it's important to periodically go back and look at what has been deployed into your SAP landscape. What custom code, for example, may have been fine at the time, but no longer meets best practices around coding standards. And doing the back scanning of that deployed code and removing it. It's also advisable to remove code that's no longer being used in your SAP landscape so that it is less customized. And identifying code that's no longer being used is also part of that back scanning approach. Third is the platform under attack. From a Pathlock perspective, we look at over 60 data sources where our rules can be applied to really begin to filter out noise and help people prioritize on patterns that indicate attack, to really avoid the false positives that may imply that something's under attack when it's not, and to help the different SOC teams really integrate their analysis, not just with SAP, but all of their IT landscape. So answering those three questions is really core to that first tier of support. Now, this session was really talking a little bit about not just your ECC landscape, but what happens when you begin to look at S/4HANA. Things change a little bit with S/4HANA. Part of it has to do with the delivery model. For example, in ECC and R3, everything that you had that was associated with SAP, whether it was the database or the operating system or the middleware, you were required to audit. It was yours, and you owned it. However, as you start to look at S/4HANA and the cloud, you begin to not own some of the underlying resources that are part of your vendor's delivery. And now you begin to rely on SOC 1 audits. And so from a first tier security perspective, you also need to begin to ask yourself, what is the delivery platform that I'm using to run my SAP landscape on? And have I got the proper conversation, or I've got the proper liaison going on with my vendor? So for example, if I look, as I mentioned, on the on-premise side, physical storage, database, operating system are all mine to audit. But as I get to the SaaS or S/4HANA cloud, public cloud, the physical storage, the database, the operating system, the middleware, and the application layer itself, some of that is going to be provided through the cloud provider, and only the application itself will be where I need to focus. So that can simplify some of the control over this first tier. Let me turn the time now over to Jonathan to talk us through a demo showing that if we don't secure this first tier, we won't be able to secure the second tier. Jonathan?
Thank you. So yes, thank you for handing it over, and thank you for the introduction. So if you look at the everyday life of an SAP system, as Stephen already correctly quoted, it's dealing with all kinds of possible entry vectors due to the also the different technologies now being implemented, and also that there are multiple layers within an SAP system. And out of a security perspective, a lot of times what's happening when you have your classical security audit, you will hire someone for doing an assessment. They will use some standardized tools, only focusing on a small piece of the SAP system. So on the one side, let's say Nessus, it's a very technical leveled scanner. So it will look on the configuration of the network of the operating system, and it will tell you, okay, you have some flaws here. But the problem is also to understand it's not only about the technical side, but also combining the technical side with the procedural side of SAP itself. So you need to have in mind that an SAP system does not only consist of an operating system, network, and database, but also of an SAP basis system, that there are SAP specific authorizations, as well as configurable checks, and as well as applications and transactions. So you really, as a pen tester, you need to know, and also as a security officer, you need to know that how to achieve security in every layer. And classical security tools do not cover SAP applications as such. They do not look at the processes or on specific SAP related settings. And then you find some typical scenarios like password sniffing, web-based attacks, which are also for non-SAP systems very critical and applicable, also applicable for SAP systems. And this is the everyday life of an SAP system, which it is facing when running in your landscape. Just a quick example. I will take the screen. All right. Just a quick example. Hope everybody can see my screen. Here, we're right now looking at an application, which is a custom developed application, and it's just only a minor application for a user which is only looking at the next payment cycles. And if we now have a quick look to let's say Apple and display, we can see okay some data which an office clerk might find useful for creating invoices or just delivering the or signing the correct number of payment to the bills. Malice is only here able to click on display, nothing else. She's not able to edit whatsoever. Main problem here now is this is within the SAP system. So a classical security tool will not detect here a security flaw. But let's say she particularly wants to have a nice life and migrate to the Philippines or somewhere with a lot of money. She can make use of a architectural security flaw called hidden OK codes. So she can type in the top transaction bar codes which are somehow you could say action codes which are resembling a button press. And if this program is not written correctly, she can click buttons which are probably, if she would have higher authorizations, being displayed, but in this case they are not displayed. So we can say here, let's say CHG for change sounds reasonable, and we can see we can hop into changing mode. We can say, well, as you probably can hear from my German accent, Malice is now German and editing the bank address to a German bank address, and now she needs to guess the OK code for saving. Well, SVE for save sounds also reasonable, and when she hits enter, we can see she has edited now the banking address, the banking information, and now she's paid next time 40 million, billion dollars. So this is a example where a classical security tool will not help you out. A second thing is looking at processes within an SAP system. Malice is also able to execute some certain programs. Especially there's one program called ZBruce. But prior to that, I want to just, as an example, prove Malice is not able to change certain users or whatsoever. She's only allowed to display. If she now goes into change mode, we can see she is not authorized to change certain users. She's an office clerk. She just needs some information on where are people living, the bank address probably to then sign the bill. And now she executes this particular program, and we can try to do that again. We can see nothing, it looks like nothing has happened, but in this point in time, your system has already been compromised. If we now, as Malice, look again on J Strauss and want to change it, we can see, oh man, she's now in change mode. She is now able to assign roles. She's now able to delete users. She has practically SAP all. And the crazy thing about this is, if you look at the change documents of the SAP system, the particular change which has been made is not being displayed. We can see the latest change was in the by Jonathan Strauss, and I have assigned her a certain role, but that's it. There's no way you can see that she has SAP all rights right now. Therefore, those are two processes or two things within an SAP system where a classical security tool will not help you out. And therefore, how would it look if you would have SAST in place? So first things first, if you look at the outcomes of the security scan, we can see here we have a finding. Programs change the authorization buffer. We can click on the details, and then we can directly see here's a certain program doing a no-no statement, the altering of the authorization buffer. The second thing is we can also see and during the time of development directly as a developer, okay, here is something probably wrong. We can see through the standard ATC, our so-called generic checks, which are integrating fully into the standard. And we can see particular in the ZBrew scan, here, the scan, we can directly see, well, here's a change of an authorization buffer, insert. We can, by double clicking, directly see what kind of priority it is. We can directly hop then into the object and have a look where this occurred. So we can see here that this particular code is doing a no-no with a certain table within an SAP system. The second thing is now, so we talked about the prevention, and how is the last thing is reaction. So as soon as we want to have a look on what has happened, we can hop into our monitor, and we can see two things here in our monitor. We can see one, that Malice has changed a particular here Malice with the authorization buffer has gained the access, gained SAP all access by the manipulation of the user BF2 table. And the second thing is we can see that Malice has also changed a certain table Z vendor, and we know, okay, table Z vendor, she's actually not able to edit this. And now we can say, well, those are two particular findings which I want to have a further look on and can now escalate. So I can create a ticket, and then it will go the normal process of escalating some malicious activities within an SAP system. So Stephen, could you take the me back to the presentation, please?
Yes, you bet.
Thank you.
Are you able to see it now?
Yes. All right. So in this particular case, we have seen now a more procedural kind of attack on the SAP system, which are two scenarios we actually gained through customer cases, where we help the customer looking at their system, reverse engineering in security breach. And this occurs way often than anybody thought. So it was not only one customer, but multiple customers which faced, especially with external consultants, such kinds of problems.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. We really appreciate that demonstration. It's I was first just going to thank you for terrifying us all when you showed us how to compromise the SAP system. And then I decided I'd get to thank you also for showing how Pathlock's able to make that that terror not hopeless, that we're able to, that there is some ability to secure the platform. I find it always interesting when you do that demonstration, how not once was PFCG or SU01 ever even considered, that it went well beyond the typical access governance approach that we've been sort of trained on for so many years, that it really had to do with vulnerability issues, code, transport, threat detection, sort of things that people needed to anticipate in order to properly secure their SAP landscape. Thank you very much. So the next point in our agenda is to look at traditional user governance. It's hopefully clear that getting to user governance itself is not something you can do with confidence if you don't have the underlying platform under control, if you don't have the patches right, if you don't have proper monitoring going on. But if you do, then the next question is, how do you make sure that people aren't abusing SU01 and PFCG, that your SAP landscape is properly secured at the user level? I think it's important as you look at the second tier to see it in terms of a chain of controls and not just a single control. I remember 15 years ago when there was a lot of interest in SOD for SAP, that a lot of people saw it as a point control. But as the industry has matured, as people using the SAP platform have learned more and more about what risks they actually face from users, they've begun to realize that it's actually a chain of controls, that their analysis, their reports on risk actually depend on the rule set, and that rule set needs to be fine-grained and well-maintained. And what do we mean by fine-grained and well-maintained? Well, it means that if you have multiple instances of SAP in your enterprise, and you have different configurations for different instances of SAP, that those instances the configurations need to be harmonized in order to get proper reporting out of your SOD tool set. And if you have a lot of change happening across your organizations, then again, that SOD rule set needs to be maintained at least at the pace of organizational change. That compliant provisioning requires real-time analysis of risk so that you can make good decisions about the most recent request. That if you don't have that risk analysis in place, then it's very difficult for you to stay clean over time. That the role catalog depends on controls associated with testing. That the design of roles requires you to be able to bring in user histories, which in and of itself is a control, and that it should be part of the recertification process, another point control. That emergency access sessions, access recertifications, role reviews, and all of these depend on properly documented workflows, because at the end of the day, it's the workflow that could be, or the procedures, as Jonathan mentions, that could be actually the weak point in your security model. And because of that, you may have the best technology, but the process is getting worked around. And then workflows themselves depend on data aggregation. And then data aggregation depends again back onto the SOD and SA rules so that you gather the right data and you can contextualize that data. And you don't need to bring an enormous amount of data forward and then sort through all of the noise. And of course, audit requires the whole of it all to be enforced and documented and tamper-proof. And so looking at the life cycle of access from the point of the role being designed and tested to the request and authorization of access, the provisioning of that access, the licensing of that access, being able to look across this entire life cycle, but also being able to look at it from a perspective of a chain of controls is essential to really being able to secure the second layer of SAP. And Pathlock itself has a very rich portfolio in covering this chain of controls, if you will, at this second tier. Being able to automate rule updates and user data aggregation, being able to update in real time how risks may change and fit that into the approval process, having a purpose-built workflow engine so that it's able to draw in the right data at the right time to support provisioning or user recertification or other workflows that are important to covering the second tier. Of course, as we look at R3, it may have been pretty simple to do this. ECC got a little bit more complex because Fiori showed up a little bit on the edge of it. But as you get into the S4 space, and you've got to anticipate this chain of controls across HANA and Fiori, it becomes a little bit more complex. And so really looking at how do you take a life cycle approach to covering the second tier around access governance, and that it's going all the way down to the database layer. You no longer sort of let that be simply in the domain of the DBAs or those who are at the infrastructure tier, but you actually include that as part of the SAP application layer, and going all the way to the front end on the Fiori side, and in properly ensuring that the access to data and capabilities in Fiori applications is being properly governed. Makes the S/4HANA landscape a little bit more complicated, but certainly doable. We do run into some challenges, though, when we look at only taking a role-based approach. For example, when it comes to properly managing data, roles may have some challenges. And part of that is because your access within your SAP landscape, even though it's one of the more complex models on the planet, it's still limited to authorization checks at the transaction and authorization object level. Now, for example, sometimes display means display all, and that's okay. But sometimes an organizational policy may mean that it should only be a display of certain values. For example, in the ITAR legislation or ITAR audits, certain data in an organization can only be displayed to certain users of a certain nationality. So in that case, even controlling the authorization object to display only is too broad of an access privilege. Roles require a formal process, both in terms of their design and their rollout, and that formal process can be much slower than the enterprise needs in order to meet its security and compliance mandates. There's limited protection of data within transactions through roles, and I've already mentioned that it can sometimes expose data when it's unnecessary to expose that data. And then there's some granularity challenges that happen around being able to report on who has accessed certain data. Not necessarily in terms of who's run a particular transaction, but who has actually accessed certain data sets within that given transaction. All of this can lead to a much more complex role design, a much bigger, a more numerous role catalog than is necessary. And whenever the role design becomes complicated and the catalog grows, that means that there's going to be more reviews, more maintenance requirements, more mitigations, and a longer time or more time before people get the access they need. So how are these risks covered from a Pathlog perspective? We've seen a lot of benefit come about because of an attribute-based access control model. And this allows us to begin to address some of the issues that roles simply weren't designed to handle. So let's talk a little bit about this third tier around transactions and data. Some people may say, when you look at this model that we have for this third tier, it's missing something. I'll go through and explain it, and then touch a little bit on where people feel like something might be missing. The first piece is discovering the data. There's so much data across so many tables within SAP that part of the proper control of this third tier begins with understanding where sensitive data is and mapping those locations to different policies, regulations, rule sets. Once you've been able to discover the data, then masking that data where appropriate and masking it in real time based on changes that might be happening at the policy or regulatory level, or that might be happening at the user behavior level. And then lastly, if you think about properly controlling data, that means you need to properly control the transactions that will change that data. And so how do you control transactions, both in and of themselves, but in particularly in terms of preventing the corruption or the misuse or the inappropriate access of that data? And even in terms of a business transaction, you can think of those as basically data changes. When someone runs a transaction within SAP, they're basically changing one data point and another data point. If I approve a purchase order, there is now data that is in a different state than it was before I approved that purchase order. So that the control of the transaction actually has to do with controlling data. So what's missing here? Well, when you think about data, part of it is, where does it reside? And we've actually already covered that. We've covered that when we talk about securing the SAP platform itself, because that's the data container, if you will. And then we've talked about it in terms of running a chain of controls around restricted access so that you can ensure that people aren't getting access to that data through the traditional role-based approaches. So this is really looking at on the control of data on top of those two previous tiers. It's asking the question, not so much how do you restrict access to data, but it's asking the question, how do you control access when it's necessary? How do you control necessary access to transactions and data? It's important to think about controlling that access, both from a regulatory perspective. As I mentioned already, GDPR, for example, has certain requirements on personally identifiable information for European citizens, regardless of where they reside. ITAR has regulatory requirements on sensitive data that's considered important for munitions and military security, nation state security, and that gets limited in different ways, and one of which is citizenship. It's being able to screen transactions. It's looking at, how do I actually put in a preventative stop? How do I block somebody from following through on an SOD violation? It may be necessary for them to, for example, have this SOD conflict because of the nature of their job. But if they begin to exploit or they begin to abuse that privilege, how do I block them so that violation doesn't have to wait until the end of the month before somebody runs the report and identifies it, that it can be prevented in real time? And then how do I begin to pull in user analytics and the management of behavior? The key piece around this third tier is that it must be system-wide. It must have some approach that is a one-to-many rule set, so that it's able to make a change in one place, so that it doesn't require multiple configuration changes or multiple changes to a rule set for each instance of SAP. It needs to be done in a business language so that it's not required to always pull in scarce technical resources in order to make the change. It needs to be able to apply a broad array of logic and use a large universe of attributes so that the rules can be properly and very discreetly managed. And it needs to be able to adapt easily without going through a heavy change management process that you would appropriately apply to things like configuration of transports. Let me give you a couple of examples or different use cases where this would be applied. So for example, maybe you're looking at how do you control HR data? If you look on the left, one bullet down, How do you control ensuring that HR master data is not accessed when someone logs in remotely, and that it can only be accessed when someone is actually on site? How do you mask or lock bank account fields after hours so that the access is only available to those who need it during the bank's business hours? One of the use cases that I've seen used around controlling data is, how could you constrain normal day-to-day operations like approving an invoice when you're under heavy expense controls, so that those invoices are maybe more rigorously reviewed in one quarter than they are typically in the other 3 quarters of the year, so that you have more positive control over your expense management. Those and other scenarios are just examples of where the coarse grain approach, using just roles, needs to have a finer point put on it in order to meet the demands that more and more enterprises are facing as they look at proper data management. Well, let me turn the time over to Audie, who's going to show us a quick demonstration of how to do that with ABAC.
Yep.
Audie, let me make you the presenter. Are you there?
Sure, I'm here. Thanks, Stephen.
Great. So you should have the ability to present and share your demonstration on how to sharpen controls at the 3rd tier.
Got it. Yeah. First of all, thanks, Stephen and Jonathan. That was a great presentation. So my name is Adi Goka, guys. I'm gonna further illustrate and show you the innards of what Stephen was talking about in terms of attribute-based access controls. So the idea of attribute-based access controls, as you've heard from Stephen, is basically using the attributes of the user, the attributes of the data, and the attributes of the context in which that access or that particular data is happening in real time. So real quickly, I wanted to show you like how these things work in the system and padlock solution for it. So basically, I have these 2 users logged onto the same system. If you see on the bottom, it's SAP GCM. And the user on the left is named Dan, and he'll be our policy administrator. And the user on the right is SAP Dev, a generic SAP user, and then he'll be the bad actor who's kind of going to be doing things. And then we'll see from Dan's access how we can stop it. And real quickly, I wanted to show you how the access is set up for these 2 guys. And both of these guys, if you look at it, are given SAP All and SAP New. And this is not required for the solution to work, but it is. I wanted to show you that this is basically none of the restrictions that you would be seeing from here on are coming from SAP, and they are coming from what we call as policy, which is a collection of all these attributes. So real quickly, when I've touched upon the policy, let me show you what the policy actually looks like. And we've set the policy up to per transaction code, whether to have transaction control, which is basically stopping the transaction itself, or whether to have, in addition to transaction control, data control, which is basically going inside the transaction and securing any of the fields within that particular transaction. So to illustrate a quick example, let me take an example of an RZ11, which is basically the transaction code to change profile parameters. So if SAP Dev goes into RZ11, even though he has access to SAP All and SAP New, we can stop him using the policy on the top here because he has transaction control checked on that particular transaction. So also what we also can do is, let's say if he goes into XK03 and he wants to view the data, and that would be the data control portion of things, and then he's trying to view the bank account details of this particular vendor. What we can do is we can use the context of this user, which is described in the context parameters here. And what we can do is we can say that we can place further restrictions. If you see, we have placed the IP group as a blacklisted IP addresses ranging from 0.0.0.0 all the way to 10.0.30.139. Now, if you look at this thing, let me quickly show you where SAP Dev himself is logging in from. And if I go in here and look at so I'm just doing a function module th_user info, and this will tell you. And if I run this particular module here, what I can see is where this person is logging in terms of an IP address. And this is geographical location, and we can use several parameters that actually give us the login information for that particular this thing. Is terminal, where is he logging in from? So he's logging in from 10.0.30.141, which is outside this particular blacklisted IP range. So when he goes into this particular transaction code, he can actually see the bank key, bank account, and the account holder details. Now, whenever we want to mask it, let me quickly show you how easy it is, for example, in the context of a GDPR data protection officer in Europe. And then if he goes and if I change that particular this thing, and Dan is changing it to 145 to extend that particular blacklisted IP range to include this user here. So, and the policies are changed in such a short time that it actually becomes easy for an organization to respond to such threats. So for example, here the data was saved, and then when he goes back here, if he goes outside of the transaction and comes right back in, you can see that I can mask bank key, bank account, and account holder. And I can also place masking templates on it so that the last 4 digits may be available to be viewed. For the bank account, the first 8 digits, it's basically your requirement. And this can happen with any data element, data field within the SAP. So now, real quickly, I also wanted to show you. You guys will ask me what will happen if somebody tries to steal my data. So I have a use case that illustrates somebody stealing data from the EKKO table, which is the purchasing order header. And if I go in here, and then if this guy is trying to look at all of this data, which can obviously be masked, it's not here. But then if he tries to download it, I can actually stop him because the policy is restricted from anybody downloading sensitive data, and EKKO is one of such tables. The other thing that we can do with the context is also place like real real controls on, let's say, since I'm looking at the data itself, I can go into the PO release, right? And I can put restrictions on what's the maximum number of dollar amount that this particular POs can exist with. I can also do active SOD prevention, which is basically looking at the document that this particular user has created. Let me quickly show you the SOD prevention this thing. So if I go back into the EKKO table, and if I go and see what this user has created in terms of purchase orders, these are all the purchase orders that is created. Now, if I go take this particular purchase order that he has created, and let me show you that ERNAM, that's the person who has created it. And then if I go back here, and then I'm going to try to do a goods receipt from SAP dev side. And if I paste the same, this is actual fraud happening in real time, right? So when I put that and try to go and create a goods receipt for this, we can actually stop him because of the policy that enforces based on the user attribute and the data attribute, which is actually the purchase order document number. So that's basically all I wanted to show you. There's several other use cases in the HR realm and everything else, but I just had to show you the SOD prevention and how we mask using the pathlog tools. Suffice it to say, please get back to us if you have any specific use cases. We'd be delighted to kind of get you through those pesky ones. Yeah. Thank you all. Appreciate your time. And then back to Stephen.
Thanks, Adi. I really appreciate that. So basically, depending on where the person logged in, that could filter their data, and based on the degree of violating their SOD violation, that could restrict their ability to finish their transactions. It would block them. The same can be applied for preventing data downloads and a variety of other use cases. So to wrap it up today, just wanted to talk about the 3 tiers of control for SAP environments. The first one is application security, where you saw a demo from Jonathan that showed that if that's not secure, you can't secure access. We talked about access governance being a chain of controls, and however that needs to get a finer point on it if you're going to be able to properly manage data and transactions And Audit then showed us how to control that third tier through attribute-based access controls and proper transaction restrictions based on business rules. So I thank you everybody for your time. We really appreciate your attendance at today's session. And if you have any questions, please feel free to talk to us. We're more than happy to continue this conversation later. Stephanie, let me turn it back to you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Jonathan, Stephen, and Adi. We have another session starting here in just a couple minutes. So if you have any questions, please email us at events@pathlock.com and we would be happy to answer those. And we hope to see you at the following sessions. So thank you so much, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks.